Hello, everybody. My name is Panagiotis Milonas. I am the Secretary of the Canadian Academics Association of Ontario, and I would like to welcome you all to the possibilities of left government in Europe. Before we begin, I'd like to send out a warm thank you to everyone, especially our wonderful sponsors. We're thrilled to have the Socialist Project and the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto as co-sponsors for this event. We would also like to extend our sincere gratitude to our host, the Center for Learning and the Social Economy and Work at OISE, for their support. A special thanks goes to Marcelo Vieta for helping us secure this lovely space. Marcelo has insightful work on worker recuperated factories in Argentina and Viome in Greece, so definitely check that out as well. Be sure to also visit our website, www.hcaao.org, to check out our exciting events that we have planned. We'd also love for you to subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated, so feel free to do that and invite others. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our guest to you today, Panagiotis Sotiris. Dr. Sotiris has an impressive background as a journalist and an editor in Athens, and has taught at several universities, including the Open University in Patra. He's starting in October 2025 at the Department of Sociology at the University of the Aegean in Mytilene as an assistant professor, where he'll teach social and political philosophy. He's also an editorial member of the Historical Materialism Research and Critical Marxist Theory. His upcoming book, titled Hegemony Strategy Organization, Reading Gramsci Today, will be published by Brill in the Historical Materialism book series, and definitely something to look forward to. I'll pass the mic now to today's chair, Kanishka Goonewardena. Please.
So I won't add much to what you just said. Thank you. Except to say that Panagiotis is also the author of, the editor and a contributor to this book, Crisis Movement Strategy, the Greek Experience, published in 2018, which is, of course, a relevant background, for the subject of the presentation today. And as a long-time admirer of Panagiotis' work as a radical intellectual, Marxist philosopher, and political activist, deeply committed and involved in the Greek situation and beyond. I should also mention his book, A Philosophy for Communism, Rethinking Althusser. I think a major contribution to Marxist thought and philosophy. And but beyond that, there's something I think about Panagiotis being from Athens and being Greek. Let me explain what I mean. So Greece is a country that I think has experienced all kinds of extreme political situations that you can imagine. Revolution, fascism, dictatorship, being and dealing with refugees, borders, wars. Although not every Greek intellectual has learned as much as they could have from this very rich and demanding history, but Panagiotis is an exemplary intellectual who I think has drawn the best lessons, and from that history and the radical left intellectual culture and heritage that is also a product of this political, unparalleled, I would say, political experience. And somebody who is not only one of the best thinkers, one of the most important and original thinkers in the Marxist tradition, in an intellectual sense, but somebody who's also deeply and committedly engaged in political organization. And and writes in several genres as a journalist and in journals like Historical Materialism and books like this. I am extremely happy to welcome Panagiotis to speak to us today.
Thanks a lot for this very flattering and, one might say, hyperbolic introductions. I'm just basically went through recent Greek history and tried to think a little bit about it. Thanks, of course, to the organizers. It's truly honored by this invitation to share my thinking. Let me start. Let me start with a clarification of the title of my presentation. When I talk about the potential government of the left in Europe, I am not referring to the possibility of a centrist or social democratic government like the ones we've seen and which more or less over the past 30 years have been equally instrumental in the hegemony of neoliberalism. I mean a government representing the strategy or ideology of some variation of the radical left. I'm also referring more specifically to how the question of a possible government of the left returned to the fore in the 2010s after a long period where it was not part of the discussion of the broader Marxist or Marxist-inspired anti-capitalist left. Because one can say that the return of radical politicization that accompanied the rise of the anti-globalisation movement at the turn of the century, and a little later the anti-war movement, initially was articulated in terms rather hostile to the politics of social democratic or centre-left parties. It drew most of its inspiration for, let's say, traditions of the 1968 left, which was rather hostile to the idea of government, and which was, in a sense, formed in rupture with both social democracy and communist reformism, in particular Eurocommunism. I'm also referring, when I speak about the possibility of left government in Europe, also to the experience of a particular conjuncture. After the financial crisis of 2008, in particular following the large global wave of protest after 2010, 2011, the Eurozone crisis, and the signs of acute political crisis in various countries that were combined with almost tectonic shifts in relations of representation, which created a situation where a series of political developments, such as the rise of Syriza to power, the electoral ascent of Podemos, in a different context, Jeremy Corbyn's successful bid for the leadership of the Labour Party, Jean-Luc Mélenchon's elevation to the position of the leading figure of the French left, and even, also to a very different context, Bernie Sanders' campaigns to win the Democratic nomination, were all discussed under the same, let's say, rubric of the possibility of a left government. Of course, the actual experience, and let me say it from the beginning, of participation of the left in governments in Greece and Spain, or even Portugal, were more than, one might say, disappointing, and in fact represented cases of defeat and capitulation to neoliberal exigencies rather than successful experiments. I mean, to be fair, one could point to some, for example, positive accomplishments of the Pedro Sanchez government in Spain, but this is not a left government, and one can say the same, can have the same balance about the participation of the left in government in Portugal. And of course, Greece is still the most spectacular case because if you see what is left now in the current political landscape in Greece, you see the exactly opposite of what was in 2015. You see a fragmented opposition, a kind of implosion of the left, in particular Syriza, and a dominant cynical neoliberal government, which is a minority government. It polls, I mean, in real terms, in terms of actual appeal, but it's still the largest political formation and acts like as it is omnipotent. So that's the kind of the background of the experience. Obviously, we're not at the same point as we were 10 years ago. After all, today the main question in Europe seems to be the rise of the far right. Perhaps one might say the gravest fallout of the defeat of the left in the 2010s, a point to which I will return. However, this debate is still going on. You can see, for example, the French situation, still an open debate, still an open question in a country with an acute social and political crisis. So it's not a debate that is, let's say, closed or irrelevant. However, and I would like to start by a small theoretical detour, a small walk down theory lane, to deal with how the question of government has always been a difficult one in the Marxist tradition. A large part of the traditional revolutionary Marxism has been skeptical of traditional governance, especially one elected through a parliamentary process. However, this skepticism did not necessarily lead to clear answers. This is evident already in the Communist Manifesto, in which there are no specific indication of what forms this, and I quote, political supremacy of the proletariat would take, or this, and I quote again, despotic inroads on the rights of property and the conditions of bourgeois production, what form this would take. Marx and Engels would admit that when, after the experience of the Paris Commune, they would suggest that the one correction they would make to the Communist Manifesto would be the insistence that the working class cannot use the existing capitalist state apparatus as it is. And again, however, even in this text of the Paris Commune, you can only find starting points, because in the end, how exactly this combination of universal suffrage, but not in the sense that I quote, of deciding once in 3 or 6 years which member of the ruling class has to misrepresent the people in parliament, end of quote, and the replacement of the standing army by a militia and the abolition of the distinction between executive legislative would work, this was not answered also in these texts. And this ambiguity was always even more evident in how the Second International also viewed such questions, exemplified by Kautsky's call for both a revolution and a democratic republic, a kind of ambiguity that also led to his gradualist approach and insistence on a long period of mainly peaceful struggles that take advantage of bourgeois democratic institutions. And I have to admit that although there has been a recent attempt to reinstate Kautsky's position in the tradition of revolutionary Marxism, one could point to, on all other aspects, excellent work by both Eric Blanc or Lars Tilly to some extent. Still, I think the ambiguity in early Kautsky is very obvious. Lenin, within the context of the Russian Revolution, would use the Paris Commune as example of an antagonistic form of the exercise of power, and perhaps tried more thoroughly than any other Marxist of his generation to think the question of how an antagonistic form of governance could emerge. But again, in his text, we still find more questions rather than answers, and we know how the harsh realities of the Russian Civil War, the exigencies of the new economic policy meant that the Soviet system gradually stopped being a democratic process. Most appointments were made from the top, and the whole system looked more like a communist-led exceptional state. And Lenin's insistence that the crucial aspect was the class character of the government left open the question of what political forms, what political practices would make possible such a proletarian control of the state. Consequently, despite the Bolsheviks' confidence that political power was in the hands of the proletariat, the question of the form of this power remained open. However, to be fair, at least in the beginning, the desire to put in place a form of government that was antagonistic to the bourgeois bureaucratic mode of politics was obvious, and I think that Laura Dowd's recent book, Inside Lenin's Government, offers a vivid image of the contradictory Bolshevik attempts towards such a different practice of government. At the same time, we know already from the discussions at the Fourth Congress of the Communist International on the questions of the United Front and the workers' government, to Gramsci's and Finish's research project in the prison notebooks, there was indeed a kind of growing realization of the complexity and difficulty of a plausible revolutionary strategy in countries with developed political and ideological apparatus, but still the question of governance remained open. At the same time, both in the Soviet Union after Lenin's death, these concerns of any concerns about democratization were set aside, and we had the strengthening of this particular state form, and the state party, particular state party formed, and the abandonment in all but name of the Soviet system, and which is also more evident after World War II and the introduction of the notion of people's democracy in the countries of the so-called socialist bloc. Of course, not all people's democracies were identical, and one could point to different experience of participation, yet the basic form was that of a government based on the power of the Communist Party that dominated both institutions of representation and ministries, a kind of a single party parliamentarism with very limited public debate. At the same time, beginning with the Front Populaire in France, already in the 1930s, communist parties had begun to accept the possibility of a process of socialist tradition that could begin with a progressive government based on a parliamentary majority. This was something that, to be fair, after World War II became close to an article of faith for Western communist parties, especially after the basic acceptance of a, let's say, a democratic road to socialism, even when it was not called in these exact words. Of course, there were other revolutions. They would open important debates on the possibility of a different road than the one taken, but still this question of the form of governance remained open. And the question of, let's say, of an institutionality that would be antagonistic to the dominant bourgeois want, which will be also, it will be prominent in the debates, of course, in the revolutionary left after May 1968, but again in a rather contradictory way, especially given that these carrots did not have the possibility to actually test whatever insights they might have. And also, whatever examples there were in the 1970s of actual revolutions, from the Carnation revolutions in Portugal to the FSLN victory in Nicaragua, they ended up in one way or the other on defeat, which also sort of created extra problems to this kind of debates. The last great debate on these questions, to be fair, was in the 1970s, when Western communist parties, in particular the Italian, French, and Spanish ones, insisted on the possibility of governmental power being part of a democratic road to socialism. And it's a big debate which included the criticism by Etienne Balibar and Louis Althusser of the French Communist Party's abandonment of the notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the discussions between Althusser and Italian intellectuals around the question of state and politics, but also the debates prompted by Nikos Pouladjas' suggestion that it is possible to have an elected government of the left combined with autonomous movements from below. Movements which, as part of Pouladjas' relational conception of power and the state as the material condensation of the relational forces in the class struggle, are always in a sense inside the state, at the same time promoting radical change. Pouladjas, to be fair, was fully aware that he was describing a limit-like situation, with many aspects of it contingent on the dynamics of the situation. However, he also tended to take for granted a strength of the movements that is now absent. Interestingly, if one can see the responses of Althusser to Pouladjas, he also has the same belief that movements are kind of very strong. And the retreat of the left since the early 1980s, the rise of neoliberalism, the right-wing turn of social democracy, and the crisis of the communist movement in all its varieties put an end to these debates. So it is on this background that the questions of left government emerge again as a strategic hypothesis in the 2010s, after a sequence which I would like to revisit. I would like to revisit why, basically to suggest that when this question of the left government reappears in, let's say, the 2010s, it reappears on a kind of strategic void. Because we know that after the emergence of important movements since the 1990s, this seemed to bring anti-capitalism back as the order of the day. If you remember, there was this sense that there was a kind of a movement of movements, which coincided with the idea that there can be broad fronts or united fronts of a new type, where the revolutionary left could work with reformists to create broad anti-neoliberal lines. This was very evident in the debates of the early 2000s, around the potential of new anti-capitalism, the experience of Rifondazione Comunista in Italy. In Greece, it was what led tendencies of the anti-capitalist left to join Syriza. It was a driving force behind European social forums and, in a sense, World Social Forum, which were considered to be the terrain which would enable such convergences. The question of government, to be fair, was not initially central, since it was obvious that what was more in question was a recomposition of the left. But it's no accident that the crisis of Rifondazione Comunista would start exactly after its participation in the Prodi government. Initially, it was Latin America that seemed to offer an alternative in the 2000s, a wave of left-wing or progressive governments based on a real protagonism of the popular classes. However, these were also contradictory, especially the Brazilian experience would be the kind of a testing ground, especially after it moved, let's say, to the right, although it still had very important aspects or experiences in collective planning and significant gains for subaltern social strata in Brazil. The Venezuelan and Bolivian experiments included more kind of a revolutionary dynamic and a kind of a more decisive intervention of strong movements, but also in terms of governments, they also remained with a very classical governmental context. And there also one could see other contradictions gradually evolving, such as the over-reliance on extractivist practices. There were, to be fair, important interventions that try to discuss especially these questions. I can point to Álvaro García Linera's well-known text on the creative tensions of the revolution in Bolivia, which also it's a contradictory text because to a certain extent it's a kind of a defense of the tactics adopted by the Morales governments. I could point to Giorgio Cicerello Mayer's writings on Venezuela, Marta Harnicker's writings, or the echoes of this experience in the work of Michael Lebowitz. But still the questions remained open. In the context of Europe, to return to Europe, despite these many returns of anti-capitalism and the emergence of a new generation of radical theories and the important defenses of the possibility of post-capitalist social configuration, strategic questions, in particular how such broad fronts could actually enable a new transformative dynamic and how to deal with the problem of power, this remained open. Moreover, more theoretical debates like the ones around the idea of communism, if you remember, it's very well known in publicized conferences, early 2010s, did not move beyond treating an insistence on the communist hypothesis more as a regulatory notion rather than an elaborated strategy, at least for advanced capitalist formations. Moreover, a part of the discussions on the dynamics of movements around 2010-2011 took a horizontalist approach, which was radical in its anti-capitalist and egalitarian participatory tropes, but refused to even touch the question of power. In other instances, such as the work of Michael Hart or Tony Negri, one can see a very creative attempt to rethink the ontology of contemporary labor and the potentiality for change. You can also see gradually, especially in the third volume of the project, Commonwealth, as also the more recent Assembly, a kind of an understanding of the importance of questions of political organization and power, but still no strategy. And I think that the consequences of such an absence of a strategic debate, despite the urgent calls by figures such as Daniel Ben Said in the 2000s to reopen the strategic debate, was evident when the crisis of the Eurozone erupted, which sort of shifted the focus of the debate from Latin America to Southern Europe. Because it was a situation where one could witness social and political dynamics were without precedent, especially in weak links of the chain, namely countries such as Greece and Spain. We saw actually what a crisis of Germany might look like in a contemporary, let's say, advanced capitalist social formation. The implosion of political configurations that have lasted for decades, to give an example, closer at home. The idea that in 2012, PASOK would, in the 2010s, PASOK would arrive at single-digit figures was something no one could imagine even 2 or 3 years before it actually happened. A party that was steadily over 35, 36% for more than 20 years. So, and I'm stressing this because I would like to stress that exactly at the moment you have the eruption of the crisis, which actually opens the possibility of an alternative government, the strategic debate was at its lowest, one might say, in a kind of exhaustion. And which also created a situation that it was accepted as granted. If you look at interventions or debates at that period, yeah, everyone was talking about the possibility of a left government as this is the way, if they had Greece or Spain in mind mainly, but there was no elaboration. At the same time, it was a difficult task. And I think at some point, Richard Seymour has a very good description of the difficulty of what it means to actually face governmental power. And I quote, "A radical government finds it difficult to wield power precisely because, if left to itself, it is rapidly encircled by those who actually hold power and who are accustomed to exercising it. Should it find a way to win time and space for its own agenda, the next obstacle it faces is that it somehow has to administer capitalism while making it work for reform. That is, it has to find a growth formula that both makes capitalism grow and profitably, while also transferring wealth and power to workers and the poor. In the 20th century, the solution to this dilemma was a mixed economy with public ownership, price and income policies, and a mildly redistributive welfare state. But that solution, insofar as it ever worked for radical ends, no longer works at all, which I think sort of encapsulates the very difficulty. And these strategic deficiencies were also evident in the case of the political currents that played a major role in this cycle of left mobilization. In the case of Podemos, the leading group opted to read these conjunctures through the lens of theories and practices of left populism, so they integrated a kind of a top-down communicative electoralism that in fact ran counter to the very processes that had led Podemos to become an important force in the political landscape of the Spanish state, processes that had a lot to do with movements from below rather than political appeals from above. Similarly, Syriza was catapulted to second place in the 2012 Greek elections and to power in 2015 as a symptom of deep political crisis and tectonic shifts in representation that made the signifier left government a kind of a point de capitone in the Lacanian sense for broader political dynamics, without this resulting in any strategic elaboration on how to deal with state power. The political culture of Syriza did not go beyond a stagist version of left governance, coming from the traditions of both Orthodox communist and Euro-communist currents of the 1960s and 70s. And although one could find in the intellectuals around Syriza, such as Kostas Rouzinas, the insistence, and I quote, "The task of the Greek left is to develop the idea of communism for an age of capitalist crisis and violent social rearrangement." In the end, this was not transformed in any actual strategizing, apart from constant references to, yeah, this is the project, but it's difficult. There were also voices, one could point to Euclid Tsakalotos, that insisted that Syriza had a transitional program, but despite these aspirations, in practice it lacked this strategic horizon and a more extensive thinking of questions of political power. And above all, it underestimated the extent of the ability of the institutional framework and social violence of the European Union and the Eurozone to block any such path. And I would like to stress this bit a little bit because it's interesting that the actual internal political geography of Syriza before the rise to power was basically tuned to a large extent on the question of the basis of European integration. Basically, the majoritary position, the leading position was the one that said, no, we cannot have a rupture with the European Union. And so anyone who said the opposite was kind of pushed to a minority position, which And basically it was also kind of silenced to a certain extent in the years prior to the ascent to power, despite, basically European Union being exactly the testing ground of the strategy and the main mechanism that led to a capitulation. Because, again, to put it in a European context, when we talk about the institutional, financial and fiscal configuration of the European Union and Eurozone, we are talking about a framework of reduced sovereignty imposed by the common currency, supposedly currency is, what is a state? It has a flag and a currency, okay? So you don't have a currency. By means of, and also the priority of European forced privatization and deregulation over national policies and all the regulations that penalize divergences from austerity policies, which is, the European Union is a kind of a constitutionalization of neoliberalism, without obviously any democratic process, etc., etc. So when we talk about that any radical change in Europe will face challenges, it's not just, the markets will oppose, they would oppose, or capital will oppose, it will oppose. We are talking also that very practical things. I mentioned, the common currency and lack of monetary sovereignty, which means that, for example, the European Central Bank in 2015 was in a position to make the Greek banking system insolvent. And as a kind of warning, there was a fourth bank holiday before the referendum, limits to cash withdrawals from ATMs, capital controls, etc. And moreover, the European Union, although it took a much more flexible position during the pandemic, still has an entire punitive system. And this is not a metaphor. There are specific fiscal penalties if countries diverge from fiscal rules, which, it's even invoked in current debates over the French debt. And European funding is very important, especially for smaller countries. And you have a precedence of European regulations over national legislation, which is not simply about, product safety. It's also about forced privatization of infrastructure, forced opening on marketing, forced restrictions on national industrial policies. Which means that rupture with the European framework is a necessity for any alternative politics. And I know that in the Anglophone world, such discussions are overshadowed by how a certain segment of the British left treated Brexit as a far-right strategy to impose anti-immigrant policies and restrictions of labour rights. I think that such a perspective doesn't understand how in the rest of Europe, and also to some extent Britain itself, European integration has been more than instrumental in making neoliberal policies dominant. The other crucial opening question, obviously, is the question of political power, because that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a left government. And in this sense, talking about political power is a welcome change from a period when the left could only talk about movements or resistances. Now we're again talking only about movements and resistances, but let's say that at a certain moment it could also talk about political power. However, there are open questions here. One can see, for example, there are entire debates such as those, for example, acceleration versus the growth or combating the impending climate catastrophe that have been articulated in terms where, the question of power, government, strategy is kind of absent. It's like you go straight to the political end without talking about the political means. I'm not underestimating the importance, but strategy is exactly what's in between. On the other hand, you can see, for example, Andreas Malm's insistence on an ecological Leninism, but still there you can find, as opposed to a Green New Deal, but still it's more like a line of demarcation. And I have a quote from Andreas. It says that no workers' state based on Soviets will be miraculously born in the night, no dual power of the democratic organs of the proletariat seems likely to materialize anytime soon, if ever, waiting for it were both delusional and criminal. And so all we have to work is with this dreary bourgeois state tethered to the circuits of capital as always. I believe this points to the difficulty of strategizing today. And I believe that the reason is that even if we treat this process as some form of use, of existing state apparatuses, it's obviously that such use implies new institutional arrangements and represents an actual rupture, a process of transformation, even if presented as emergency use of existing apparatuses, and I will return to this later. Another question that obviously emerges in this is, what are the social forces that could support such a strategy? Obviously, the classical Marxist position that the working class, because of its very class position, is more open to social change and transformation as a starting point. However, there are questions to be dealt. We have all the new forms of casualization, precariousness, special dispersion, fragmentation, and atomization of labor, or the dismantling of previous common grounds and the new divisions and the hierarchies that come along. And we have all the divisions inside the working class induced by racism and nationalism, which is more evident given the current rise of the far right in Europe. And this is becoming even more urgent question, because currently we're seeing very significant indications that significant segments of, let's say, and I use it for lack of better words, the old working class, the traditional working class, manual labor in traditional sectors are shifting to the far right in impressive numbers, whereas on the other hand, that's a positive development, more educated yet precarious segments of the, let's say, newer working class are moving to the left. If you look how, for example, this is very evident if you look at the statistics of French elections, where you can have like 57% of people saying that they are ouvriers, which has a very specific manual worker connotation in French rather than the more general English term workers. The majority, they vote for the far right. So, and you can see similar tendencies in Austria or Germany and other countries. So, yeah, this is a big question. And such questions point to the fact that although labor as a common condition of exploitation and oppression can be a unifying factor for all these segments of contemporary capitalist societies that depend one way or the other upon selling the labor power, at the same time, actual unity based on common conditions requires overcoming divisions. Therefore, unification is neither granted nor automatic, but requires political work and adequate hegemonic projects. And also, it's obvious that the disintegration of traditional forms of working class concentration, the transformation of previous strong forms of working class identity, and the gradual distancing of working class voters for the parties that supposedly represented them, exemplified in the crisis of not only communist reformism that already took place by the end of the previous century, but also traditional social democracy, which more or less is still going on, has made connecting working class and transformative politics more difficult. And despite that there are persistent working class struggles, that wage labor actually has expanded. And yeah, one solution that has been suggested is what can be described as left populism. And I'm using that both to cover specific theories of, let's say, Laclau Mouffe-inspired left populism, but also a more general practical terms. This idea that we should not focus on class analysis or class composition, we should focus on a kind of discursive interpellation that will transform grievances into a mobilizing force. I think that this will foster a politics from above, communicative in essence, and electoral in scope, which can fail and basically leave the, and end to a discursive battle with the far right, which in certain instances, because it starts with stronger notions of community, like nation or race, it might take the upper hand. So instead, so I think that still the question, it remains the classical Marxist question. How you can have a transformative politics that can be based on class analysis, dynamics of class struggles, but also the realization that there's no automatic translation of the social into the political, but this does not mean an autonomization of the political without any reference to material realities. And as I said, this is even more urgent due to the rise of the far right. The other open question is, how to deal with the transformation of the state. I mean, we know that even we start ourselves based on the Marxist debates of the 1970s, we still have an even greater apprehension of the complex and pervasive character of the functioning of the modern state. And the way neoliberalism is a strategy inscribed in the very materiality and configuration of the state, not just a political choice. Very big importance is how, and this was an insight that Poulantzas already had in the 1970s, that the international process of internationalization and globalization are internalized in the state, are inscribed in the material reality of the state. And the European integration, in this sense, is an exemplary case. And there was research, such as the one by Leo Panitz and Sam Gidin, that has actually already stressed that how all these points, the challenges for any question of left governance. So this sort of, I tried to offer an overview. What was the absence of strategic preparation and elaboration that can explain the defeats of actual attempts towards left government in the 2010s, as attested in the Greek case, but also, one might say, Spain or Portugal. Does this mean that we abandon the question of a left government, in the sense that by definition such an attempt is doomed to end up in failure? So what we need is to basically prepare for something else, whatever this prepare might mean, even if it means not actually taking advantage of conjunctures. I think this is too easy an answer. The events in countries such as Greece point to a certain historical possibility. Singular conjunctures where it is possible to have shifts in electoral representation that can potentially lead to such outcomes. There is a symptom here, an historical accident or potentiality that we need to confront. Because if we're talking about any real process of transformation in countries such as Greece, it's very difficult to imagine a sequence different from that of a severe political crisis prompted by intense social movements, shifts in political representation, and a kind of an electoral mutiny from the part of the subaltern classes that could send something like a left-wing formation to the position of power. I cannot think of any other sequence. I cannot think of a kind of, a collapse of the state where, some form of counterpower will substitute the state. I'm not sure that a civil war in the sense, a traditional sense, is possible in contemporary Europe. I'm not saying that things can always get, history has more fantasy, far more imagination than us on the wrong side sometimes. But if you look at this kind of, so this seems like the only possible sequence. So you have to actually think through it. So how can we think? The first point is to remember that elections are by definition not democratic. To recall Althusser, I would say that parliamentary elections are an ideological apparatus of the state, not simply a democratic process. This has to do with the political and ideological practices they entail, the individualization they inscribe, and which sort of reflects the atomization and individualization of the level of relations of capitalist production, as Poulantzas has shown. Consequently, it's not possible to have an electoral road in the sense of a smooth increase of electoral forces that would bring social change. The fear of liberals in the 19th century that universal suffrage would lead to the poor outvoting the rich, unfortunately, never materialized. And the only way that elections can have the effect of a rupture is if there is a real political crisis, a real crisis of hegemony with a political formation that can sort of fill the political void, which also means that social movements are not kind of a background to electoral struggle. Social movements are crucial. Without social mobilization and the kind of transformative effects that social and political mobilization, especially in crisis situations, that can have on the people who participate, you cannot induce the kind of political crisis that could enable such kind of potential use of, let's say, the electoral road. And so, yeah, I mean that unless there is some kind of degree of mobilization of the subaltern class beyond a normal threshold of discontent, there's no point in discussing the idea that we can gradually, and in normal situation, build an electoral coalition aiming at political power. I'm not saying that it's wrong to participate in election, I'm saying that it won't have the possibility. I mean, an experience shows that the electoral strategy, the best example being the Italian Communist Party in the 1970s, in the end ends up with a kind of the opposite result. It can end up in a kind of reabsorption in the political system and a transformation into a party of the state. So the electoral victory can only be an aspect of a broader sequence of struggle that would make possible, let's say, an historical accident. And obviously, such an event would lead to, facing the materiality of the state. Now, we often refer in this debate, and even in the Greek debates, Poulantzas was often invoked, of that relational conception of the state. So the state is a condensation of the material relational forces. The popular classes are already always inside the state. So the left arrives to power, we have social movements, we change the balance of forces. I mean, there is a crucial word. Poulantzas speaks about a material contention. And the relational does not mean non-material. So, and where we're talking about a materialized relation of forces, this is inscribed in institutions, laws, the design of cities and buildings, the functioning of the police, and the line that courts of justice follow. And especially neoliberalism and globalization and European integration has really affected the materiality of the state. Not only it has increased tendencies already evident in what Poulantzas described as authoritarian statism, that is, the shift from the legislative to the executive, and when we're talking about a shift to the executive, we're talking a shift to zones fully insulated towards popular forces, and the biggest example is European Union. European bureaucracy, which is very instrumental in the actual production of the actual regulatory production, for all countries in Europe, is totally insulated for any sense of popular control. You have a right to be heard in the European Union. Actually, any message that you send to the European Commission might be read by some bureaucrat, but that doesn't mean anything. So, and at the same time, we know that there is this kind of, let's say, stiffening of the neoliberal character of the state, strengthening of the oppressive aspects, and obviously the hollowing out of the state, which leaves practically an abandoning segment of society and creating new zones of exclusion. So this is the general difficulty. So how do you deal with that is something that you should come in terms. The other, obviously, is the rupture of also this also changes even it's obviously you cannot speak of any ability to just take the current apparatus of the state and use it, and use that phrase from Marx, for despotic inroads into private property. Obviously we will face the opposite. And obviously you also have the very difficulty of breaking with the European framework. It also means that the question of physical violence also is an open one, given the current militarization of oppressive apparatuses, and in particular the police, the expansion of digital surveillance, the expansion of parallel state apparatuses, etc. So all this is not just, we will have parliamentary oversight. It's obviously would require, in a sense, this is the real abolitionist perspective. One needs to deal with how to actually reduce the ability of such apparatuses. And this is why it's interesting to revisit the idea that it's necessary first to sort of implement a constituent process, which is something that comes from the Latin American experience, Venezuela and Bolivia. Jean-Luc Mélenchon recently, I think, sort of brings it back in his calls for a sixth republic. I do believe, yeah, somehow you need to create a social and political momentum for institutional changes that would enable a transformation of the state. But on the other hand, we have the experience of Chile, and we have a defeat, and the defeat was not in the elections, the defeat was in the constituent process and the rejection of a really progressive new constitution. So this is also. So all this points to, let's say, the difficulty but necessity of rupture, which in my opinion, and with all the respect I have for his work, points to the inadequacy of Eric Olin Wright's position that, and I quote, large-scale ruptural strategies for constructing a democratic, egalitarian, social, and therefore seem implausible in the world in which we currently live, at least in the developed capitalist economies. I'm not saying that I don't disagree with the difficulty. I disagree with the conclusion, which is, and I quote again, this idea that we need strategies of interstitial or symbiotic transformation, avoiding large scale. And as I said, I agree with the difficulty and the complexity, but one of the problems we will face is that today even relatively minor transformations require major ruptures with institutional articulation of contemporary neoliberalism. Perhaps I'm overdetermined here with the European context, which also includes the specific weight of European institutions and European integration, and as I said, all this really penalizing mechanism. But yeah, without reclaiming some kind of sovereignty against such processes and some kind of ruptural process against the existing institutional framework, you cannot have lots of change. And since in many debates in the left, including the debates of that period, the debates around Syriza, there was all this discussion that opting for sovereignty against the European Union is a kind of nationalist position, and so we need an internationalist, so we need to change the entire European Union. I do not think that it is possible that in today's Europe, there can be a kind of coordinated revolt or a kind of coordinated, electoral victory that would bring social transformation all over Europe, either in the national level, coordinated national level, or the level, let's say, of the European Parliament, which, as we know, is there more like a kind of to add some legitimacy without having, real power. I mean, the democratic deficit of the European is structural, and obviously it's an articulation of social formations with very uneven characteristics. So you cannot possibly hope for that. So I would like to think that still, the old metaphor of the weakest link of the chain, it's still more pertinent. So if you can have a ruptural process in one country, this could be an example for other countries, and it could be a more effective form of internationalism, which means that this was this was basically the chance that was lost in 2015 in Greece. So far, I mean, what I tried to say, I spoke a lot about the difficulties, which are based on this idea of, the real materiality of constraints described in the state, described in the European Union. So, okay, so how you can counter this? I think that another aspect that tends to be underestimated in this debate is that how to think of forms of counterpower or even dual power from below as a means to deal with the, by definition, institutionally and strategically weak position of any left government. I mean, by this I'm saying that we can describe the current arrangement of the state as a kind of excess of force from the part of capital, a real material. So you need to find some way to counter this excess force. And I think this is where treating movements and struggles as terrains where you can see the emergence of potential forms of counterpower, and also even, let's say, dual power of a new kind. I know that this is far from the original definition of dual power in Lenin. I'm not exactly faithful here to Lenin's writings, but for lack of better metaphor. And I think this is very important. So you need to have this kind of mobilization. You need somehow to counter it. And which this will counter the materiality of the state, help the fulfillment of a constituent process, enable the overcoming of hardships, and enable also induce transformation. And it's also crucial in another aspect, which is also strategic. So we know that any social transformation from one faces the persistence of capital and social forms, the persistence of the value form, the fetishistic character of the market, even under public ownership. So it's obviously that this cannot be transformed by diktat. It cannot be by decree. So it requires a kind of a broader process of societal, cultural, ideological, everyday transformation. And I believe it requires, let's say, experimentation. And I believe that if you have such a strategic emphasis on social movements, counter movements from below, experiments, in a sense, you can actually learn how you can have alternative social configurations. And it also sort of overcomes the element of alienation from these processes. Consumers wanting to have a say about the products they consume, students and parents to have a say on schooling, patients having a say on health system, and above all, workers about the production processes. And I think all this such form of collective experimentation can also be described by this, let's say, enlarged conception of dual power, that I think it's instrumental in any sense of actual, which in a sense it links social experimentation and the art of insurrection. And it also enables us to have more, and I use a phrase by a comrade and colleague from Catalonia, Josep Maria Tentas, a kind of strategic imagination. And so that's why I think this was also a debate that was never took place, even although very occasionally evoked rhetorically. This idea of we need forms of counter-institutionality from below. Obviously, there are limits to that, because one, it's very difficult. It's easier to have the kind of collective mobilization and participation during moments of crisis, especially when there is a sense of abandonment. So if the health system collapses, social clinics, cover a real need. If there is if there's a collapse of, a social collapse, social kitchens and things like that suddenly become important. Obviously, some things at some point might return to normal. So how you can make, so this is one difficulty, and obviously the other difficulty is that unless some of the gains of counter, movements from below are turned into institutional arrangements sanctioned by the state, in the end they might lose power or become symbolic. But still, these are important aspects. And I know that there is but what about, but these are perhaps luxuries. We're talking about urgent needs. Well, I think that in moments of crisis, and I still have the Greek crisis, there are moments where the need to deal with the immediate comes very close to the strategic, and I will give an example. For example, it's obvious that I think, and I still believe that in 2015, especially after the referendum and the tremendous mobilization of force from the subaltern classes, it was possible for Greece to, exit the Eurozone, go for rupture. It would have been a very difficult situation with many practical problems. It would have required mobilization, and it would have required extremely radical measures, which in a sense would bring the strategic closer, because you would need to nationalize banks, nationalize strategic infrastructure, try to maintain production without possible, let's say, capital strike to sort of undermine the whole situation, try to, organize the provision of basic needs. So you see, it's not like kind of luxury to think that you might find yourself in exceptional situation. And actually, it was this thing was outside the thinking of the liberal, of the leadership of Syriza. That was the problem, because in the end it proved that for the leadership of Syriza, the exit, a world outside the Eurozone or the European Union was like medieval maps, where at the outskirts there are monsters. I don't believe there were monsters. I believe there was a potential for social change which was lost. So I would like also, but this also requires a kind of, and I'm coming to near the end of my presentation, that there is a kind of a different strategic thinking. I believe that we can only think through these questions in terms of a potential historical bloc, which I believe is a term that in Gramsci is not a descriptive term, it is a strategic term. It doesn't point simply to a social alliance, it points to the combination of an alliance with a subaltern, with a strategy and a transformative social and political process, which exactly creates a common strategic orientation, overcomes the fragmentation and disaggregation of the subaltern classes, and actually creates a new historical path. And I would suggest that we also need to, at some point, to give a name to such a process of forming a new historical process, to this collective we of emancipation. And I think we need to suggest that we're not just building a movement, we're building a people. We're creating a people, or a nation if you prefer. I don't have a problem with either words. And of the subaltern and their historical potential. And to that direction I would point to very recent, very interesting debates in France on these questions. I would point to the elaborations by Julia Boutelja and also interventions by Stathis Koudalakis. And we can discuss more about that in the discussion. And obviously there is also, and this, since we remain classical Marxists, brings us to the question of organization. One of the problems that are facing when we're talking about the left in government, we're not talking about, how the parties of the left, either social democratic or communist of the 1970s, which were still parties with a very real strong footing in the working classes, other subaltern strata, trade unions, forms of collective organizations, parties rooted in the realities of these majoritarian segments of society. I mean, even when formations were big, like the Labour Party under Corbyn was the biggest party in recent British history, or even Syriza. Syriza was never a very big party, never reached the size that PASOK had, for example, even when PASOK was not in power, in the 70s. They don't have the same organic relation to subaltern strata, which was also aggravated by problematic logics that were dominant, which was basically they all treated the parties as electoral machines. Even the idea of the United Front was transformed into an electoral front. Even when this was not articulated explicitly, Podemos had an entire theory, especially articulated by Errejón, that parties should be an electoral machine, so it has to be from top, projecting discourses, not very organizing. Most of the parties we're talking about still opted for a model where the leadership was kind of autonomized from the mass base. There were technocrats or political professionals that were important, and also the experience from the movements really never found its way to the actual processes of strategizing. And even interestingly, even when there were, let's say, democratic processes, they were more about factions rather than, about this idea of experience. So I still believe that we need we need an idea of the front not as an electoral machine, but as a laboratory of strategies and tactics in a way that can bring together movements, organizations, unions, and transform this knowledge coming out of the struggles into radical theory, discourse, program, and strategy. And I still think that Gramsci encapsulates that in the following quote. And one should stress the importance and significance which in the modern world political parties have in the elaboration and diffusion of conceptions of the world, because essentially what they do is to work out the ethics and the politics corresponding to these conceptions and act as if it were as a historical laboratory. The parties recruit individuals out of the working mass, and the selection is made on practical and theoretical criteria at the same time. The relation between theory and practice becomes even closer the more the conception is vitally and radically innovatory and opposed to old ways of thinking. For this reason, one can say that the parties are the elaborators of new integral and all-encompassing intellectualities and the crucibles where the unification of theory and practice understood as a real historical process takes place. I think this still is the best description I can think. So, what do all this mean? It's obvious that all these experiences we're discussing tonight are not just failures, they are learning experiences. We should be able to learn even from defeats, and this is important. So, and I will not, obviously I cannot offer a definite answer on the possibility or impossibility of a left government, but I think it is a way to revisit, what are the crucial questions. And it's not about simply, having an abstract kind of theorizing. It's more about ways to deal with conjectures that are by definition singular and original. And I think that only a return to a more strategic way of thinking can put tactical choices into perspective and think through whatever we choose, to what extent, to what end does it work. And I think that Daniel Ben Said has offered a very nice way to describe this, saying that revolution is not so much a political design, but rather it's a regulatory horizon for radical left political practice. So the question is not if we have a grand revolutionary design, but for example, how we think of every step we take can indeed be part, let's say, of the constant political self-pedagogy of the subaltern classes by means of their own involvement, their own initiative, and their own learning. I know that the contemporary social and political landscape does not offer lots of ground for optimism. Obviously, there are important developments, social and political mobilization in France, for example, the impressive wave of Gaza solidarity all over the world, and still many other struggles that we see. But on the other side, we're, as I mentioned, more faced with the challenge of the rise of the far right, rather with the challenge of the rise of the radical left. So, are we facing, like a still trapped in a kind of a fail again, fail better Beckettian situation? No, I don't think so. But we need to regain our collective ability to think. And to think in a way, I think there's a metaphor in Machiavelli that I find useful. He says that archers aim higher to go further. So I think this is in a way what we need to do today. Try to think strategically even when the situation calls us to think tactically. Not by abandoning everyday struggles, but by thinking every step we take to how it can be articulated with a broader strategic vision, how it can be a learning process, how it can be part of recreating the possibility. Obviously, any historical accident, including an electoral victory of the left, is an historical accident. It will catch us, in a sense, unprepared. But, preparing for the unexpected can take different forms, and we can be better prepared. So, and to reverse a phrase from that Gramsci loved, we need a certain optimism of the intellect to counter the current pessimism of the world. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to help keep track of the questions.
So, value form. Yeah, obviously, I mean, yeah, obviously one aspect is, ideological struggle, try to explain. Although, to be fair, sometimes us left-wing intellectuals believe that workers don't feel that they're exploited. They do feel exploitation is a very, very material thing. They feel it in their votes, they feel it in their everyday life, they feel in their sense of abandonment. So the question usually is about if you can think an alternative. That's where the ideological barrier is today. And today's capitalism is not very inclusive, to be fair. I mean, basically, it's more about, yeah, what else? That's the best you can get. It's not bad, it's not good, but not. So yeah, that's one aspect. What I was referring when I was talking about value form was also about something else. When you're trying, and this comes if you go through the experience of socialist experiments in the 20th century, they never moved beyond a certain, let's say, substitution of the market that left in a certain way the value form there. And this created limitations to the extent of planning, etc., etc. Obviously, I do believe that you cannot, let's say, in an administrative way abolish the value form. It will resurface in many instances, and we saw it in the Soviet model. So in this sense, you must leave much more space. To use a metaphor, you will need a lot, not a metaphor, a lot more of new economic policy, accept that, but you also need to experiment with antagonistic configurations. And this can only be thought of as an experiment, as an experimentation. So how I can have an alternative distribution, what it means to have non-market distribution or non-market oriented production, how you can, this requires immense societal and cultural transformations, because what is the value? The value form is this naturalness. I want something, I have money, I can get it, I don't have money, I cannot get it. This is this kind of, miscognition of what is really happening. So how to make solidarity, to give an example, equally natural, this requires a kind of a deep cultural transformation. So I would say that you might need lots more of new economic policy and more of cultural revolution at the same time to use these seemingly incompatible historical examples to deal with this challenge. So that's why I think that experimentation, even small-scale experimentation beginning, can be a learning process in such process. Obviously, this would require very big debates on what is planning and what planning. Aaron Benana wrote 2 very interesting articles in New Left Review very recently, the last 2 issues, very interesting kind of revisiting of the debates on planning and economic calculus. But I still think that apart from the economic kind of planning economic calculus, you need the kind of transformative, let's say, micro practices that could induce new social configuration. I'm not an economist, obviously, so I have all the liberties of a philosopher to talk about things that he's not a specialist in. I agree, counter-institutional far right, far right and European Union. Now, that's an interesting fact. That let's go back to the old metaphor that English Channel divides European continent and Europe and Britain. Okay, in Europe, defined in this sense, the far right does not talk about rupture with the European Union. All the major forces, or all the, if you take whatever, Rassemblement National in France, FPÖ in Austria, AfD in a certain sense in Germany, France Bloc in Belgium, the far the Meloni government, which is, don't forget, Giorgia Meloni started her career as a neo-fascist activist that used nom de plume in meetings because they were semi-clandestine in their far-right activism. So, they are all in favor of the European Union. They might want a different configuration, etc., etc. They might oppose some policies, but they don't speak about rupture. Brexit is a different thing, and I think if we know, I mean, my opinion, which is obviously external, is that if the British left, and the British left had a chance because of the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn at that moment to sort of accept and say, okay, we can do Brexit better than the other, rather than following, let's say, the line of Guardian columnists that Labour should be the party that would, make the referendum void. Things would have been it would have been a different direction, and whenever the left lives, and because it's also, but also points to another question that I only briefly mentioned. There are some, because we spoke about the appeal of the far right to working class. Part of it has to do with the way the far right recuperates the nation, recuperates a kind of a strong collective identity. So which poses a challenge for the left. That's why I referred in particular to this French debate, which I found very interesting, for example, the work of Houria Boutelza, because you say, okay, why should only the far right talk about the nation? Why not, use the nation and suggest that, okay, how can we find common ground? How can, and Boutelza's point is very specific. He says, how can what she calls the barbarians, which is the working class segments of migrant origin, can have common ground with the buffs, the kind of, let's say, the white working class, the redneck working class, if we spoke about North America, can't have a common ground. The traditional left-wing answer is, well, we persuade, the nationalists that, working class is beyond borders. And says, okay, this is not possible. How can we do it? We can find common ground. Where can we find, for example, common ground? They want sovereignty. They want, they don't like the European Union. We also don't like the European Union. Why not start from this premise and try to have kind of common ground? I'm obviously oversimplifying a very good book that is also available in English since last year, entitled The Rednecks and the Barbarians. I think this is the title, if I remember correctly, translation. But it's an interesting point that, yeah, there are things that you can find common elements, like sovereignty in the sense that, there is a kind of, not only a symbolic kind of, a common identity, but also, real power to decide in a country what is to be done. And obviously this is totally hijacked by the far right now for very specific, but this doesn't mean that the left shouldn't try to think, at least in the European context. And to give another example from the European context, which I often use, for example, but if you're in favor of sovereignty, you're in favor, let's say, of borders, or closed borders, or things like that. Well, if you're in a country like Greece, the only way to open borders to migrants, let's say, have a different, non-far right migration policy, basically accept refugees, accept migrants. And in Greece, this is, for various reasons, social, economic, demographic even, it would have been a positive development right now. You need to control the borders. Right now, Greek borders are European borders. and Europe wants closed borders. So things are a little bit more complex on such questions such as sovereignty. Obviously, I'm not saying that the left should simply praise nationalism or patriotism, but it's not like that. It should transform them. But it should aim at saying we're building a people, this is a society, this is not a fragmented society of movements or fragmented communities. We try to bring the subaltern together as a kind of a democratic force, a kind of collective will that will impose social change. And we need to find ways to actually articulate this. And we can do it in a much better way than the far right, because in the far right, in the end, it's simply rhetoric. In the end, it is abandonment of these people in their basically a continuation of the misery. We can combine this with something different. So this is basically my thinking. I'm not saying that it is easy, and I understand fully the difficulties that the British left faced regarding Brexit, including the fact that British labour law and British social rights were so awful that European regulation seemed like an improvement. All over Europe, actually, European regulations meant deterioration of social rights. If you follow how European, let's say, regulations on labour have evolved. Well, I'm not talking about re-hijacking anything, because to be fair, the very emergence of notions like the people of the nation in modernity, in capitalist modernity, were always forms of, at the same time, recognition, displacement, and miscognition of the subaltern strata. So this is, we're talking about an open contradiction in such forms of political discourse. What is the idea? If you see the very idea of the nation, what is the idea? Yeah, we are all parts of the nation. We know the mystifying aspects. We're not the same. We're not the same nation because there are class divides. What is, let's say, the recognition aspects? The subaltern are part of the nation. So the same goes with the people, a notion even more, one might say, politically performative in this sense, given that it goes back to, how the people was formed as a kind of a collective demand. So I'm not saying that we can try and find ways to describe that we are indeed, reclaiming society, redrawing the line of demarcation between what is this society as a collective and what is not part of it, and obviously point to real enemies, which is basically the capitalist class, in a sense. I'm oversimplifying, of course, but so yeah, it's about like that. I'm not saying it's easy because it depends on different conjunctures, different discourses, different histories, but we do need to find this way. So, but what I'm also trying to say is that this, to be fair, one might ask why this is different for what Laclau might have said in his books, his book on populism. Because the problem is that in Laclau there's no sense of social composition. There's no sense of what is this? What are these social strata? What are the material ways where they're interconnected? So the populists, the invocation of the people comes from the top, comes like a discursive appeal. I'm saying that how can we reconstruct the people from below? From common struggles, from forms of solidarity, from forms of common knowledge, from forms of common histories, not just through, and common demands whenever it is possible that can bring, different segments of the subaltern together, which is not easy, but this is exactly, politics was never easy, and to be fair, the working classes were always, divided. If you look at the history of the subaltern, unification was always the exception, not the rule. You can see that in how long it took for North American working class movement to stop being heavily racist in its divisions. You can see how resistance movements, for example, during World War II in Europe, created unique broad movements dominated by communist parties, but we actually meant overcoming huge difference. To give an example, I mean, the Greek Communist Party was a very small party, which also was sort of alienated for certain segments of areas of Greece because of political mistakes in the 20s and 30s. So, and it became a majority force, like without precedent during the resistance. Why? Because at a crucial moment it offered a common struggle. So but this was real, was material, was like not just some kind of discourse. Contemporary far right is fully accommodated to neoliberalism, and is becoming even more accommodated to neoliberalism. This is exemplified in the figure of Trump. Trump's economics, let's leave aside trade wars. If we look at internal US policy, it's neoliberalism on steroids, which is also its main contradiction, because neoliberalism on steroids in the US context means tax cuts create deficits require the international role of the US dollar, etc., etc. It might be undermining or not. Who's the biggest supporters of Trump? Big business. So there's no sense. So it's just a discursive construction, which obviously has been dealt in the most hideous way, a savage theater of violence against the most weak segments of the working class, namely migrants, offered as a kind of a spectacle to people that will say, oh, he's doing something. And I don't think that it will work, given that how low his rates of approval are currently are. So yeah, that's the far right. It's got nothing to do with with. It's not a discursive question. It's whether you can think of how to bring this fragmented, more fragmented than ever, but also bigger than ever, subaltern working class mass. Because in reality, if you look at all the statistics, how wage labor is dominant and expanding as a dominant form of employment. If you see how the expansion of actual commodification and of terrains, of social terrains. So yeah, how you can bring this together, overcome divisions, both below and above. So this is the very notion of the historical bloc, and it also requires knowledge of this. One of the problems that we are facing now is that contemporary, even mass parties, do not have the kind of rooting that would give them knowledge. We tend to forget what it meant to have what mass parties were, what kind of information hub a party like the Italian Communist Party would have been, despite all the shortcomings or the problematic positions, or the big social democratic parties in Europe in previous decades. So yeah, today we have large segments of the subaltern classes where the left has only a sociological knowledge of, rather than a kind of real engagement with in the way it should. So yeah, so it's a material process, not a discursive one. I mean, I think that all the debates you mentioned were kind of are important and creative. For example, if you take Negri and Hart, I mean, I might have tons of disagreement with Negri, but he always had this kind of ability to say, okay, what's the new in a situation, and what is the dynamic we can find. So yeah, every saying globalization, I see the multitude. I say, capitalist reconstruction, I see positivity. It could have been problematic, but also had this kind of, a certain kind of, let's say, insightfulness that we should not, underestimate. So I think, but at the same time, yeah, Negri could not strategize on this. And it's interesting that he could acknowledge questions. For example, Commonwealth is a question of hegemony and organization. Assembly comes closer to the question, let's say, of power. But then he thinks it's a non-sovereign constituent power. He uses this kind of metaphors as if he wants to avoid it. But in a certain way, this is part of the trajectory of Negri, because Negri starts with a kind of a very particular Leninism, in the sense of a kind of insurrectionary working class Leninism, factory working class Leninism. You can see in Poterio Peraio, which then realizes that it's not the case. And then his whole trajectory is about finding social forces, but not the question of power sort of never closes the circle of finding a way. So he ends up in the end with reformist, very moderate propositions. Like, I mean, in Multitude, it has, I think it's Multitude, I think, that he says what we need is contemporary cahiers de doléances to sort of articulate the grievances. I'm not underestimating, as I say, the creativity. Yeah, that's the problem. The same goes with entire debates like accelerationism or the growth. I mean, the debates, even those that were against, and then you see, okay, we can talk communism. The difficult question in the entire history of the working class movement is not to describe communism. I mean, when there's a description by Karl Marx in German ideology where he says, like we would, work a little, hunt, read a lot, and obviously debate and have factions all the time, but without exploitation. So we know what communism, the question was always socialism. To use the old distinction, the question was always transition. And transition means power. Power to change things. So this is strategy. And obviously the same goes for the debates around techno-feudalism, which I think I'm not a big fan of the techno-feudalism notion, even in its most, in my opinion, better articulated form, which is by Cedric Duran, which is really interesting, because basically I think that it misses the deeply capitalist aspect of this changes. And you're also right in a sense. You mentioned left Keynesianism. Yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that we need to. There are two big open questions. One is political power, how to deal constraints. The other is what it means to have an economic policy that is not simply left Keynesianism, although I will be in favor of having left Keynesianism. I would be favored in having, I 1970s welfare state. I mean, I remember when I was, starting to read Marxist things, not understanding a lot, let's say, second half of the 1980s, and John Milius, very important Greek Marxist. He had a very important, and he would translate texts by that very important also German review, Prokla, Probleme des Klassenkampfs, and they would have this fantastic critiques of social democracy, and he would say, we are not for the welfare state, we want to go beyond the welfare state, and May 68 was still quite short. So today, I would love to have welfare state. I would love to have a decent, even trade union bureaucracy, rather than the disgrace of most, let's say, the Greek General Confederation of Labor. I would even like to go back to have Andres Papandreou again as a prime. I have to admit. But obviously, this is the crisis. Okay, so one question, obviously, the other question is economic policy, because I think in the contemporary relation of forces, in the contemporary global articulation of forces, you cannot just say we'll have monetary sovereignty, kind of an expansive fiscal policy, and redistribution. This would be only first steps, unless you sort of real change the balance of forces, which means different non-market social forms and provisions, you will be defeated. So this is a very, and in this sense, to be fair, the debates around the growth, accelerationism, all this stuff, even in their abstract and leaving aside the state power question, they are useful. Because at least but they need, somehow all this need to be more articulated rather than in a non-academic way. Now, the question of social movements and the party fall. Yeah, that's a big question, because in a sense we are going through a certain crisis of the party form. I mean, in Europe, you don't have the kind of mass form, you don't have. Part of the crisis is on, is on the positive side. People need more democracy, people need more debate, need more space for militants, that's a good part. But part of it is also that parties are no longer the kind of collective organizations they used to be. Obviously, even when they were also bureaucratic and tended to tilt to the right. And there are instances also where there would be important debates at the top, strategic, which never were never open to the bottom, and one could visit all the debates around the European communist movements. I mean, from let's say from the very important critique of, let's say, Il Manifesto and that group on the problems of Italian Communist Party in the 60s, to Althusser, interventions, what must change in the party. You can see that, but today we're in an even worse situation. So the idea of the party, the metaphor, I think, of the laboratory is that we need kind of an open process where we can have both movements, let's say, and political forms, with at the same time respecting the autonomy of movements and being part of the same process. But this requires some kind of, this is difficult because this needs also experimentation. You need institutions where you can really get that input from that knowledge and transform it. The idea is not just have a knowledge process, to have a transform experience into strategy. And also, vice versa, strategize more movements. So it's a kind of pedagogical relations which also includes, works both ways. And yeah, this is what we're missing. And while at the same time, to be fair, we have great theoretical resources, because on the other side, the collective degree of knowledge that is still produced, even in academic terms, on such questions and experience and all this recent, let's say, process and waves after waves of radicalization of students and academics has also helped that. We still have, and the question is how can we bring together? I mean, that's an open question that could only take place in terms very specific to it, but this is what we need. It's not just about the base being heard, although this is also an important aspect. It's also to be heard in a real way. This also has to do with what kind of how political, let's say, leaderships emerge, whether they emerge through traditional forms of professional politics or through movements, what they gather from this experience, what, let's say, democratic institutions are there, and yeah, these are open. So this depends also on the different situations. But it's an open question that I think is important. You're absolutely right. And although Lars Tilly has tried to persuade us that things didn't happen exactly this way, for the sake of argument, I would stick to that old image that has haunted us, that, he returns, he's treated like he's gone crazy, and he tells them we should take power, we should change the name of the party, and we should have an international. So I think this still is pertinent. And you're absolutely right that unless we maintain this deeply rooted internationalism of the working class, which was not an intellectual thing, it was a reality. It was something that you could find in workers' circles. You could find it in the 19th century. You could find it to be appealing. These were this idea, yeah, that we are beyond the nation. Yeah, we should maintain that, and we should try always to keep that a kind of a, let's say, a subaltern universalism. The idea that the subaltern condition is a universal condition. It's beyond borders, it's beyond nations, and there is something common, and which was also, to be fair, the greatest service rendered by the historical communist movement, with all its shortcomings and all its tragedies. For a certain period, decades, it projected this image that there is an international thing that you, and if you look at, the communist press and over that period, you would see this. Not just they would say, people would really feel that, yeah, what's that verse by Nazim Hikmet? I remember it from the Greek translation, which says that the other half of my heart is shot in Greece. This idea that if something happens to people like us in another country, it happened to us. Well, yeah, obviously we need that. There's no question about it, and we also need to use the way that contemporary European working classes are multinational, multi-ethnic in origin, as a way to create such conditions. Exchange. We don't have a common national history, but we have common histories that are very commonalities, and these are experienced by the way that one could see. We could see it, for example, in the great moments of North American, socialist movements. Early 20th century, this kind of unity, starting by migrant communities. So yeah, obviously we need that. And we need to insist on that, we need to remind that, we need to, constantly deal with that, kind of a new international. That's, for example, what is so crucial about Gaza Solidarity. It's a kind of a unifying thing, and this idea. But at the same time, what we're facing is not, it's a very unevenness of class struggle. Unevenness of class struggle is always both opportunity and danger, such as that I think there's a Chinese ideograph that sort of covers both sides. It's an opportunity. Your country can be more unstable, the relational forces will be more positive, so yeah, you should grab the opportunity, but at the same time, it's a challenge, it's a difficulty. You can be isolated, you can receive pressure. And to be fair, leaving aside institutional arrangements like European integration, internationalization of capital is by definition a way to internalize pressures for higher productivity, and pressures for higher productivity means pressures for capitalist organization. So, and this is something that we also saw even in certain experience of socialist construction in the 20th century. So yeah, that's my take. It's not that you just inherit the nation and the nation state and you take it for granted, but it is a necessary. It's the only starting point you have if you really want to change things. But at the same time, you should always remember that it's not enough. And obviously, this means that there are terrains, for example, if you look at Europe, if you look not only at Europe, globally, that the left can also sort of recuperate, let's say, forms of international cooperation. What it means to have different forms of, international cooperation, exchange, economic relations, because you cannot have an isolated economy, and even although some Maoists in Greece were sympathetic to Albania in the 1970s, it's still, and we used to listen to the Greek, the Albanian radio in Greek, which was a kind of, obviously it was not a model for socialism, that kind of isolation. But yeah, we should. What kind of, for example, take Europe. Which is the best? For example, one could think of Mediterranean cooperation, which in certain instances the common elements are bigger than, let's say, between South and North Europe. You can think of different alliances. Yeah, obviously, and you can try and see if there are other movements, other experiences that you can. Obviously, this is part. The problem is today that we don't have it. We don't have anything, to be fair, on the international terrain that could substitute, even for something like the tricontinental, as it were, even something like the countries of the Bandung Declaration. We don't have it. I mean, I really want to see the West defeated in any sense. I don't think that, for example, the hope comes from a kind of Russia, China axis or something like that. I don't think that's the kind of international cooperation we're looking for. So this is one of the problems we're facing. But obviously we need to have something to say on that, suggest how we want the world to be. In a sense, there's a phrase that Gramsci uses in a couple of points. It means that the crucial point is for the subaltern to become state. It doesn't mean that they should be statalized in a sense. It means that they should think strategically as running a state. And obviously the litmus test for the left is if it can start to think what it means to run a state, its level. I'm not saying this is the way to win elections, or go out, hello, we are a small group saying, comrades, this is our government. No, you have to think. When you suggest something, when you intervene in a movement, when you have a very specific proposal to make for the functioning of the health system, or a struggle to support, do you try to do all that kind of strategic thinking, or you're just echoing demands? Because I don't think that movements need megaphones. They can be loud by themselves. So the idea that political organization is just a megaphone of movements, and then it adds whatever received Marxist tradition it has as propaganda. No, this is not the kind of dialectic I think we need. So yeah, so I fully agree with you that the challenge of internationalism is there always, and it should be integral part of our thinking, even when we try to sort of recuperate, let's say, the nation. Well, first point about delinking. Syriza never had a strategy of delinking from, which would mean, rupture with the Eurozone. This was the immediate thing. It never had a structure. This was the strategic choice made early on. And this was the missed opportunity was exactly the referendum. The referendum created a kind of political momentum that would have enabled legitimacy to a ruptural policy and a kind of mobilization that would help overcome the obvious initial difficulties. But sometimes, to put it jokingly, people say, well, we shouldn't have left the euro, because if we left the euro, we would have a strong reduction in salaries, increased unemployment, and deterioration of public info. Well, that's what exactly what happened to stay in the euro. So this is it. I'm not sure that this would have been dependent on some assistance from the part of Russia. Russia, obviously, because it was exactly, this coincided with the first period after the Crimea-related, and the first wave of Crimea-Ukraine sanctions, so they are still lots of economic relationships were open. I'm not sure that a Greece that would have been kind to the outskirts of Europe, let's say with one leg out of Europe, would have been so much a kind of a investment target from the part of Russia. Obviously, would have. I'm not sure they would have preferred a country that would have been part of the Eurozone and continue to have increased relationships. This is a big debate because it also depends on how to interpret certain events, like their proposal for increased economic collaboration, a new kind of stream to bring natural gas. So yeah, it's an open, but I think the main question was to the link was whether to go towards the road of a rupture with the European Union. And obviously, Samir, I mean, in that sense, the notion of delinking is very important. It would have been exactly this thing. So because, you know, economic imperialism in Greece is the European Union. This is, I mean, if we were to use classical terms. Regarding Palestine, I mean, obviously, whenever you have such big, you see changes. I think, to be fair, in North America, the change was bigger because, to be fair, the North American solidarity movement was bigger, especially during the first year, let's say, of the new genocidal war from the part of Israel. And it was a very transformative one, which can explain the repressive backlash we're seeing. We did not have the same kind of movement in Europe, to be fair. This had to do also with a kind of discursive preventive censorship. There are countries where solidarity to Palestine was penalized, like Germany, and still is, with sort of, and it's only gradually that you can see how the solidarity to Britain was also another exception, very big movement from the beginning, and I think this might also account, if they manage to get out the current, I think, impasse they have with the new party, part of the dynamic around it would also have come from the big solidarity to Palestine in Britain. In Europe, you are starting to see it more now. You can see how important it is in the French context. For example, if you saw this September's mobilization, the block everything kind of mobilization, you can see Palestine flag. You can see how, especially for a younger generation, Palestine becomes a point of reference of a broader country. You can see it in France. You can see it in Greece now, in the level where we also, I mean, the Greek left, the problem with the left is, well, we are always in support of Palestine, so if you see for 1 year everyone was in support of Palestine, but not much was, now there's a very strong, there was a significant Greek presence in the march to Gaza. There is a significant, there are 6 ships now, 6 boats in the flotilla now, so yeah, you can see it how it also has the same transformative effect. You can see it in Italy, and you saw it in this big mobilization of Monday. And it's interesting how the most, yeah, and obviously also it's important for some trade unions, for example, when for example, it's interesting, for example, in Greece, the mobilization from dock workers is interesting. Why this is one still a place where still there's a kind of a strong union with some real gains. So yeah, there is a transformative effect, and I think it will work towards, which also points to the importance of Gaza Solidarity Day. It creates a kind of, not only a kind of practical internationalism, but also, as you mentioned, it politicizes people against imperialism, because yeah, the struggle against Zionism is the struggle against imperialism. So I'm totally in agreement. Yeah, I didn't speak about identity politics. That's correct. There are some reasons for this. One is that sometimes when I think of all this, I think in a provincial way of Greece. And in Greece, to be fair, sometimes when people speak, oh, there's a problem with woke culture, I like to say, listen, let's have some wokeness first. In a country, I mean, there are some Greeks here that can understand me, in a country that is, including the left, is very sexist, okay? Very patriarchal in many aspects. So yeah, let's be woke and then discuss if we went to a lot towards that direction. Okay, let's start. So, but obviously this is not a proper answer to your question. It's obvious that identity politics have been used, in certain instances aspects of it have been instrumentalized even against the subaltern. The French, I mean, Stefan knows these debates much better than I. In the French instance, an entire version of feminism, for example, has been used to stigmatize immigrant families, accusing, basically creating this figure of the violent, sexist migrant male who is, responsible, and we're going to liberate them, the women, the females from that kind of violence, which was not only in the sense that it happened in the US. So obviously, the problem usually here is that sometimes the left forgets that there's a socialist way to, I might say, to deal with such questions. And there's a liberal way. And the problem is that the questions are real, obviously. Obviously. Sexism, patriarchy, domestic violence, homophobia, all these are very real problems. But there are one way is to deal in a liberal way, which means as individual rights, as a kind of anatomized right to an identity, like a personal thing. Like, I own my labor power, but I have to sell it, but I also have my identity that I can, do what I want. So, but there's also, I suppose, we need to find there's a different way. Think it as collective demands. Think it as part of thinking it as part of creating. I will use the phrase popular unity. So how do you unite the people? If you can overcome these things, if you think in that way, which obviously is a dialectical way to go. You can't go in a, for example, sometimes you should see what's the best way, how you can. Obviously, we need to overcome, because this creates real divisions. This creates real divisions in the subaltern. That's the problem. It's not simply about the human right. It's about creating divisions inside the subaltern. But how do we overcome? We need to find different ways, more collective, more solidary, more thoughtful, less abstract, less carceral in certain instances, to use debates. So this is the way. Obviously, we need to do it, because unless we do it, these are going to be exploited by a far right that is investing in this kind of, let's say, patriarchal kind of tropes in a certain ways, or classical sexist roles, even, of course, not perhaps in the way traditional fascism was, but it still plays with it, and plays with, and to put it simply, when we're talking about working class, real working class subaltern strata, the phrase, anyone can do what they want, is a terrifying phrase. Because anyone can do whatever they want to do means the bosses can do whatever they want to do. It's a kind of an aggressiveness. So if you go in that direction, individual rights, it doesn't. But if you start talking, okay, that's about, people, real people, neighbors, your children, your sister or your brother, family members, community members, people you work with, you go through the same shit every day. Then the idea of solidarity, and that some people might can easily be different, but still can be all together, acquires a different materiality, which is beyond the individual idea of anyone can do what they want. So, and well, the same goes, for example, to other questions. I mean, so yeah, people say, yeah, we, for example, yes, we need to fully embrace, reject traditional family models, yes. At the same time, sometimes for working class people, the family can be a kind of social nucleus of last resort. So you need to find balances and create solidarities rather than saying, oh, these people are are thinking backwardly. No, I mean, the same. This is the story of the working class for all its history, and to be fair again to the historical communist movement, it did offer a great service, at least in basic, women's rights, kind of this basic quality. It was a very progressive force and sort of created different forms of solidarity, and we need to sort of find what this means today to actually deal with such challenges. So this would be my tentative answer to your question.
Thank you so much, and I also want to thank the audience for your really engaging questions for after such a thought-provoking and important, talk. And I just want a couple of words. I can't keep you till midnight, but some crucial relationships, were kind of came up in the conversation between movements and party, nationalism, internationalism, tactics and strategy, solidarity and sovereignty, and how to, politics, if politics is a space of these relations, and how to negotiate, and you mentioned the word balance also. So there's a lot to think about. I feel like, my mind is already a bit of a laboratory, but I really love the Machiavelli metaphor, to go further,
Aim higher.
aim higher. However, if you aim too high,
Yeah,
that's not good.
Yeah,
There's a balance, Anyway, thank you so much.